Number 10. Peter Kürten. Peter Kürten was a German man known as the Vampire of Dusseldorf who took the lives and took advantage of many people between February and November 1929. The first death he definitely committed occurred on May 25th, 1913. During the course of a burglary, he encountered a girl named Christine Klein asleep in her bed. Peter strangled her, then slashed her twice across the throat with a pocket knife. Now this made him excited down there, if you know what I mean, due to him hearing the dripping from her wounds onto the floor by her bed and on his hand. He then did this multiple times to countless other victims. Then one day Peter confessed to his wife that he was the Vampire of Dusseldorf, and in the information provided to detectives, his wife explained that although she had known her husband had been repeatedly imprisoned in the past, she was unaware of his culpability in any deaths. He was arrested and was charged with 9 counts of homicide and 7 of attempted homicide. Now he pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity to each of those charges, but he was found guilty and sentenced to death on 9 counts. Now he was also found guilty of 7 counts of attempted homicide. Now Peter displayed no emotion as his sentence was passed, and at 6 o'clock on the morning of July 2nd, 1931, Peter was beheaded via guillotine. Since he loved blood, his last words were, "Tell me, after my head has been chopped off, will I still be able to hear at the sound of my own flashing from the stump of my neck? That would be a pleasure to end all pleasures." Now that is just disgusting and ew. Number 9. Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan was the founder and first Khagan of the Mongol Empire, which later became the largest adjoining land empire in history. Having spent the majority of his life uniting the Mongol tribes, he launched a series of military campaigns which conquered large parts of China and Central Asia. In the 13th century, he ended the lives of so many peasants that carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere were significantly reduced as a result. Now during his 21-year reign, his destructive armies were responsible for the deaths of up to 40 million people. He died in August of 1227, but his death was kept a closely guarded secret. Now according to legend, Genghis Khan's last words were, "I have conquered for you a large empire, but my life was too short to take the whole world, that I leave you." Now whether he uttered those short sentences or not, his successors were more than happy to take up the challenge. Number 8. Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer ended the lives of many young men in Milwaukee, where he would then dismember them. It has been reported that he ended the lives of 17 males between 1978 and 1991. A detailed search of his apartment revealed 4 severed heads in his kitchen. A total of 7 skulls, some painted, some bleached, were found in his bedroom and inside a closet. Investigators discovered collected blood drippings upon a tray in the bottom of Jeffrey's refrigerator, plus 2 human hearts and a portion of an arm muscle. In his freezer, investigators discovered an entire torso, plus a bag of human organs and flesh stuck to the ice at the bottom. Elsewhere in the apartment, investigators discovered 2 entire skeletons, a pair of severed hands, 2 severed and preserved male sex organs, a mummified scalp, and in a 57-gallon drum, 3 further dismembered torsos dissolving in an acid solution. A total of 74 Polaroid pictures detailing the dismemberment of his victims were also found, which is just disgusting. Although he was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and a psychotic disorder, he was found to be legally sane at his trial. He was convicted of 16 counts of ending someone's life and was to serve 16 terms of life imprisonment on February 17, 1992. Then on November 28, 1994, he was beaten to death by Christopher Scarver, a fellow inmate. His last words were, "Christ Jesus came to the world to save all sinners, of whom I am the worst." Number 7. Thomas Grasso. On December 24, 1990, Thomas Grasso strangled Hilda Johnson using her Christmas tree lights in her Tulsa home. He stole $8 from her purse, $4 in loose change, and her television set, which he sold for $125. 6 months later, after moving to New York, he ended the life of Leslie Holtz, a man from Staten Island, on July 4, 1991, and stole his security check. New York detectives investigating the death of Leslie arrested Thomas, and within 2 weeks he had confessed to the police. He first told investigators about the Staten Island killing gang, and then about the death of Hilda Johnson. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 20 years to life on April 21st, 1992 for the death of Leslie, and on September 28th, 1992 he pleaded guilty to the death of Hilda and was sentenced to death in Oklahoma. Although his last meal included 4 dozen steamed mussels and clams, a Burger King double cheeseburger, a half dozen barbecue spare ribs, and 2 strawberry milkshakes, he was disappointed that they substituted spaghetti for SpaghettiOs. Due to this, his final words were, "I did not get my SpaghettiOs, I got spaghetti, I want the press to know this." Now, not that this is scary necessarily, but you gotta admit, it's messed up. It was his last meal ever and they didn't provide it to him. Number 6. Tom Blackjack Ketchum. Tom Blackjack Ketchum was an American cowboy who later became an outlaw. Blackjack and a group of others were named as robbers of a railway train in 1892 with a large payroll aboard. The second major crime attributed to Blackjack was the death of a neighbor, John N. It's alleged that he was also involved in the disappearance and presumed deaths of Albert Jennings Fountaine and his son Henry Fountaine in early June 1896. Then Blackjack and his brother Sam, and possibly others, robbed a combined store and post office. On July 11th, 1899, the gang, without Blackjack, robbed a train again at Twin Mountain, and on August 16th, 1899, Blackjack, supposedly knowing nothing about the July 11th holdup, single-handedly attempted to rob the same train again at the same place and in the same way that he and Sam and others had robbed it just a few weeks earlier. He was arrested, and at the trial, he was convicted of attempted train robbery and sentenced to death. He was hanged, and his last words were, "I'll be in hell before you start breakfast." Ironically though, the hanging was botched, with the noose ripping his head clean off when the trap door was retracted. It was said that his body landed with both feet on the ground and remained upright for a short time after. Number 5. Peter Kürten. Peter Kürten was a German man known as the Vampire of Dusseldorf who took the lives and took advantage of many people between February and November 1929 in the city of Dusseldorf. The first death he definitely committed occurred on May 25th, 1913. During the course of a burglary, he encountered a girl named Christine Klein asleep in her bed. Peter strangled her, then slashed her twice across the throat with a pocket knife, and this made him excited down there, if you know what I mean, due to him hearing the blood dripping from her wounds onto the floor by her bed and on his hand. He then did this multiple times to countless other victims. Then one day, Peter confessed to his wife that he was the Vampire of Dusseldorf. In information provided to detectives, his wife explained although she knew her husband had been repeatedly imprisoned in the past, she was unaware of his culpability in any deaths. He was arrested and was charged with 9 counts of murder and 7 counts of attempted murder. He pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity to each of the charges, but he was found guilty and sentenced to death on 9 counts, and he was also found guilty on 7 counts of attempted murder. Peter displayed no emotion as the sentence was passed, and at 6 o'clock in the morning of July 2nd, 1931, Peter was beheaded via guillotine. Since he loved blood, his last words were, "Tell me, after my head has been chopped off, will I still be able to hear, at least for a moment, the sound of my own blood gushing from the stump of my neck? That would be a pleasure to end all pleasures." Number 4. Georges Jacques Danton. Georges Jacques Danton was a French lawyer and leading figure in the French Revolution. In August 1792, he became the French Minister of Justice and was responsible for inciting the September massacres. In spring 1793, he supported the foundation of Revolutionary Tribunal and became the first president of the Committee of Public Safety. Georges was a key figure in the case of Duamoris. In early October 1793, he left politics but was urged to return to Paris to plead as a moderate for an end to the terror. His continual criticism of the Committee of Public Safety provoked further counterattacks. At the end of March 1794, he made a speech announcing the end of the terror. Within a week, he became embroiled in a scandal concerning the bankruptcy proceedings of the French East India Company and was guillotined by the advocates of the revolutionary terror after accusations of conspiracy towards the enemies of the revolution. On March 30th, the 2 committees decided to arrest him and he was sentenced to death. He was one member of a group of 15 people beheaded on April 5th, 1794. His last words spoken to his executioner were, "Don't forget to show my head to the people, it's well worth seeing." Number 3. Joachim von Ribbentrop. Joachim von Ribbentrop was a German politician and diplomat who served as the Minister of Foreign Affairs from 1938 to 1945. He became a close confidant of the dictator running Germany at the time, to the disgust of many party members who thought him superficial and lacking talent. He was appointed ambassador to the Court of St. James, the Royal Court of the United Kingdom, in 1936, and then Foreign Minister of Germany in February 1938. He did the utmost to support a declaration of war on the United States after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and helped facilitate Japan's decision to attack the United States in 1941. He was arrested in June 1945 and was convicted and sentenced to death at the Nuremberg trials for his role in starting World War II in Europe and enabling the death of Jewish people. On October 16, 1946, he became the first Nuremberg defendant to be executed by hanging. He reportedly turned to Henry F. Grecki, the prisoner's Lutheran chaplain, before the hood was placed over his head and whispered, "I'll see you again." Number 2. Karl Panzram. Karl Panzram was a killer, arsonist, burglar, and someone who took advantage of men. In prison confessions and in his autobiography, he confessed to having committed 21 deaths, only 5 of which could be corroborated. He is suspected of ending the lives of more than 100 men in the United States alone, and several more in Portuguese Angola. He also confessed to having committed more than 1,000 acts of taking advantage to men. His last words were, "In my lifetime, I have murdered 22 human beings. I have committed thousands of burglaries, robberies, larcenies, arsons, and last but not least, I've committed sodomy on more than 1,000 male human beings. For all those things, I am not in the least bit sorry." Now, that is just plain disturbing. He had no remorse at all, and it seems like he confessed to an extra death. And coming in at number 1 is Jake Bird. In 1949, Jake Bird, sometimes referred to as the Tacoma Axe Killer, was arrested by police after breaking into the home of Bertha Klutt and her daughter Beverly June Klutt and ending their lives with an axe. Upon questioning by authorities, Jake revealed intimate knowledge of 33 other deaths of Caucasian women, which made him a prime suspect in those as well. On July 15, 1949, he was hanged at the Washington State Penitentiary, but not before he uttered what would be later known as the Bird Hex in his final statement. He said, "I'm putting the Jake Bird Hex on all of you who had anything to do with me being punished. Mark my words, you will die before I do."
Starting off this list in our number 10 spot, we have Alexander Prokorenko. In 2016, Alexander was a senior lieutenant with the Special Armed Forces of the Russian Armed Forces. He was 25 years old at the time and was fighting in the Syrian civil war. On March 17th of 2016, during the Palmyra offensive, he found himself surrounded by ISIS militants. Not wanting to be captured alive, and also bravely doing what he thought was best, he ordered an airstrike on his location. His command was slightly confused in the beginning of this order and asked him to confirm his order, and that is when Alexander spoke his final words to command. He said, quote, "They're outside. This is the end, Commander. Thank you. Tell my family and my country I love them. Tell them I was brave and I fought until I could no longer. Please take care of my family. Avenge my death. Goodbye, Commander. Tell my family I love them." Alexander left behind his wife Katya and the child that they were expecting at the time of his death. He was nicknamed the Russian Rambo after his death and was awarded the title Hero of the Russian Federation for his ultimate sacrifice. In our number 9 spot today, we have Michael Ney. Michael was the first Duke of Elchingen and was the first Prince of Moskva and was a French military commander in the French Revolutionary Wars as well as the Napoleonic Wars. He was even one of the original 18 marshals of the empire that Napoleon I created. After Napoleon was dethroned and exiled in 1815, however, Michael was arrested and tried by the Chamber of Peers for treason. When the verdict was given, 137 peers voted for the death penalty, 17 voted for deportation, 5 abstained, and there was 1 single vote for acquittal. Unfortunately, this was a majority rule situation, and Michael was sentenced to death by the firing squad. On December 7th, 1815, Michael was put in front of a firing squad and he refused to wear a blindfold. He was surprisingly given the right to order the fire himself, and before doing so, these are the final words that he spoke. Quote, "Soldiers, when I give the command to fire, fire straight at my heart. Wait for the order, it will be my last to you. I protest against my condemnation. I have fought 100 battles for France and not one against her. Soldiers, fire." I Couldn't imagine having to be the one to order your own death, especially when you don't want to die, so this one definitely leaves quite an eerie feeling. In our number 8 spot today we have Gregorio del Pilar. Gregorio was a general of the Philippine Revolutionary Army during the Philippine-American War and is known for being one of the youngest generals in the Revolutionary Army at just the young age of 22 years old. He was nicknamed Boy General and was also known for being quite a ladies' man. In 1896, Gregorio finished his Bachelor of Arts and was going on to complete more education, but when the revolution broke out, he enlisted himself for military service. In 1899, the Americans were advancing on the Tiré Pass, and this is the battle that unfortunately was Gregorio's last. He was sadly shot in the neck and died almost instantly. While his last spoken words weren't recorded, it was his final diary entry that I want to talk about today. His final entry read, quote, "The general has given me the pick of all the men that can be spared and ordered me to defend the pass. I realize what a terrible task has been given to me, and yet I felt that this is the most glorious moment of my life. What I do is done for my beloved country. No sacrifice can be too great." It obviously shows how incredibly dedicated he was to his country, and perhaps he had some sort of inkling that this battle just may be his last. At the end of the day, his legacy certainly lives on.
And now at number 7 we have Timothy McVeigh. He infamously said, "I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul." If you guys remember, he was the one behind the Oklahoma City bombing, which killed 168 people and injured over 680 others. This bombing is actually the deadliest act of domestic terrorism in the United States. His execution date was set for June 11, 2001, and he made a request to have it publicly televised, but this motion was denied. He invited a composer to perform classical music on the night of his execution, and he requested to have a Catholic chaplain. He also requested 2 pints of mint chocolate chip ice cream as his last meal. He was executed by lethal injection, and his wait to be executed was way shorter than most inmates waiting on death row. He only spent about 4 years on death row, while most inmates spend an average of 15 years. The infamous Jeffrey Dahmer is next up at number 6. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms for murdering 17 men and boys in the Milwaukee area, and this is between 1978 and 1991. He was also heavily into necrophilia, and he kept his victims' body parts in the freezer so that he can just eat them later. The interesting part of this story is that Jeffrey Dahmer wasn't given the death penalty. His inmate actually beat him to death because he said that Jeffrey Dahmer was a sick and creepy man. And yeah, he was. He used to make this person food look like human body parts, and he would cover them in ketchup to resemble blood. So according to Jeffrey Dahmer's murderer, his last words were, "I don't care if I live or die, go ahead and kill me." And now at number 5 we have Tom Blackjack Ketchum. He was an outlawed cowboy who murdered someone in 1895. After that, his gang fled to New Mexico, where they committed more robberies before he was captured during an unsuccessful attempt to rob a train. He was quickly arrested, put on trial, found guilty, and sentenced to death by hanging. When his execution date arrived, it was the biggest public display in the area because he was the first person to be hanged for a train robbery in New Mexico. However, things didn't go as smoothly as they hoped. Before he was hanged, he said this, "I'll be in hell before you start breakfast, boys, let her rip." And right after that, he said the rope completely decapitated him, and it is said that his headless body landed on its feet and stayed standing upright for quite some time. John Wayne Gacy had 3 famous last words, and this comes into number 4. He kept it short and sweet when he said, "Kiss my ass." I don't know about you guys, but I think I would have, a lot more to say for my final words than "kiss my ass." But then again, he was a textbook serial killer who didn't really have any emotions. He was known as the Killer Clown because he used to dress up as Pogo the Clown and perform at many charitable events and birthday parties. He took the lives of at least 33 young boys in Illinois, and he would bury their bodies underneath his home. So when he was convicted of sexual assault in 1968, the police were able to find all of the dead bodies that he tried to cover up. Despite a bunch of corpses being found underneath his own home, he maintained his innocence. But he was found guilty in 1980 because there was just so much compelling evidence against him. He was given multiple death penalties and life sentences, and finally, after being on death row for 14 years, he was executed by lethal injection. Aileen Wuornos is up next at number 3. Aileen had a terrible childhood that was full of abuse and abandonment, so it's almost no surprise that she went on a killing rampage that would define her as America's most infamous female serial killer. She worked as a prostitute and she killed 7 men that picked her up along the highway. Aileen said that all of her murderers were out of self-defense, but she was also convicted and sentenced to death for 6 of the murders. She was executed by lethal injection on October 9, 2002, but before she died, she said this: "I just like to say, I'm sailing with the rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus, June the 6th. Like the movie, a big mothership of all, I'll be back." I don't even know what this even means, but I am pretty scared. And June 6th, what happens on June 6th? Carl Panzram's last words makes it onto this list at number 2. You probably don't recognize his name, but he is actually known as one of the most sadistic American serial killers of all time. He had more than a dozen aliases, and no one knew anything about what he has done for years until he was captured in November 1928. Before his death, he confessed to killing 21 people and sexually harming 1,000 males. Is this real life right now? And right before he was hanged, he said, "In my lifetime, I have murdered 21 human beings. I have committed thousands of burglaries, robberies, larcenies, arsons, and last but not least, I have committed sodomy on more than 1,000 male human beings." That is just sickening, and for all those reasons, I'm not the least bit sorry for this guy. The Vampire of Dusseldorf falls onto our list at number 1. He is known as a vampire because he would occasionally attempt to drink the blood from his victims' wounds while they were still alive. But eventually he was arrested and sentenced to death by beheading because he committed a series of murders and sexual assaults. He even admitted to killing a 9-year-old girl. It is confirmed that he murdered at least 9 people, but the police suspected that he brutally murdered a lot more people. So one evening before his death, he ordered a Wiener Schnitzel, a bottle of white wine, and fried potatoes, and the next morning he was taken to the guillotine to have his head chopped off. But before he left this world, he made one last scary statement that probably haunted the people that were at his execution. He said, "Tell me, after my head has been chopped off, will I still be able to hear, at least for a moment, the sound of my own blood gushing from the stump of my head? That would be a pleasure to end all pleasures." I mean, yeah, after hearing that, I'm definitely gonna have nightmares, and if that wasn't enough, his mummified head is on display right now in a Wisconsin museum after doctors tried to cut it open to find reasons behind his evil. I mean, you can't make this stuff up.
Kicking off the list at number 10, Sir Isaac Newton. Alright, yeah, we'll start this list off back in the early 1700s. Why not? Let's start crying back in the olden days. Sir Isaac Newton lived until he was 80, and back in the 1700s, living until you're 80, why, that's practically unheard of, right? That's insane. Newton started to experience digestion issues, but come 1727, he blacked out and never woke up again. The man died at 84. His last words were sad, of course, as are all of these on this very sad list that I'm doing, in a hopefully not sad way. But they go as follows. "I don't know what I may seem to the world, but as to myself I seem to have been only like a boy playing on the seashore and diverting myself now and then and finding a smoother pebble or a prettier shell than the ordinary, whilst the great ocean of truth lay all undiscovered before me." What exactly that means? Let's all talk about it in the comments. Let's try and decipher that. There we go. Number 9, John F. Kennedy. A little more recent, jumping to the 1960s, President John F. Kennedy was killed while riding in a motorcade. We all know this one, of course. I don't have to go into grim detail about what happened here. He was riding alongside his wife, of course, First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy, and in front of him there was Texas Governor John Connally and his wife Nellie. They were all rolling along when Nellie said to John, "You certainly can't say that the people of Dallas haven't given you a nice welcome." The president then said back, "No, I certainly can't." And just moments later, that's when he met his fate. Number 8, Alfred Hitchcock. This man went out with a zinger. Classic, what a classic drama queen. Alfred Hitchcock worked alongside famous painters and literary figures throughout history. He's an icon. He teamed up with Cary Grant, Jimmy Stewart, Dorothy Parker, you name it. In his 1945 film Spellbound, Alfred even brought on Salvador Dali, like the real Salvador Dali, to help him with the film's dream sequences, right? He had a vision, he knew what he was doing. He also terrified many people for years to come. It's also a fun one. Hitchcock is known for going great lengths to keep his endings a secret, like Psycho, for example, a 1960s classic. The ad department for the film told audiences to please not give away the ending, as it's the only one they have. That's fun, that's cute. Weirdly mirrors his last words in real life. As he was dying, Alfred said, "One never knows the ending. One has to die to know exactly what happens after death. Although Catholics have their hopes." That sounds very Alfred Hitchcocky.
In our number 7 spot today, we have Murray Hudson. Murray Hudson was born in 1938 and was a sergeant with the Royal New Zealand Infantry Regiment. On February 13th, 1974, Murray was a drill instructor and was supervising a training exercise when things took a really dark turn. One of the officers in training, or a non-commissioned officer who was participating in this training exercise, accidentally armed a grenade that he was about to throw. This is obviously an incredibly frightening situation, and one that made the officer completely freeze. After all, what do you really do in that situation? Murray saw him freeze and realized what had happened and ordered him to throw it, which I guess is the smartest move and the only thing that you can do. The officer unfortunately was still frozen and wasn't reacting, so in an attempt to save him, Murray went over and took his hand and tried to release the grenade so that he could throw it. During this process, the grenade unfortunately exploded, which took both of their lives. The final words of Murray were his directions and him saying, "Throw it! Just throw it." Such a tragic event that absolutely could have been avoided. Murray was awarded the George Cross after his passing, which is the highest award bestowed by the British government for gallantry not in the presence of an enemy. In our number 6 spot today, we have Sanada Yukimura. During the Warring States period in Japan, there was one incredibly famous samurai warrior. Sanada Yukimura, whose real name was Sanada Nobushige, was an incredible fighter and is best known for being the leading general on the defending side of the siege of Osaka. Sanada is known as a hero and has even been called the #1 hero in Japan. Unfortunately, the summer siege of Osaka Castle was his last, where his haunting last words come from. He ended up being mortally struck, and this is when he stumbled out onto the field while removing his helmet. This is when he said the words, quote, "I am Sanada Nobushige, no doubt an adversary quite worthy of you, but I am exhausted and can fight no longer. Go on. Take my head as your trophy." These truly might be some of the coolest last words ever, and that is sincerely a reflection of the type of warrior he was. In our number 5 spot today, we have Sir Philip Sidney. Sir Philip Sidney was born in November of 1554 and was an English poet and soldier, and is one of the most prominent figures of the Elizabethan era. In 1586, he joined Sir John Norris in the Battle of Zutphen in the fight against the Spanish, but it was during this battle that he was shot in the thigh, which would ultimately lead to his death. One of the most well-known stories about Sir Philip Sidney is when he was lying wounded next to another soldier who was also wounded. He spoke his last words to the other soldier when he was giving him his water. He said, "Take it. Thy need is greater than mine." It seems as though he must have known that he was about to pass, but it also shows the kind of person he was, which seems to be a very noble person. He certainly left a legacy, considering we are still here talking about him today. In our number 4 spot today, we have John Sedgwick. John was born in 1813 and was a military officer and Union Army general during the American Civil War. On May 9th, 1864, he and his men were at Spotsylvania Courthouse, and he was directing different placements when Confederate sharpshooters, who were around 1,000 yards away, began shooting at them. This of course caused for some of John's men to duck for cover like any regular human being would when being shot at. I'm not exactly sure why, but John seemed to have been less concerned with the shots and more concerned with the soldiers taking cover, and he continued to strut around and said, quote, "I am ashamed of you. They couldn't hit an elephant at this distance." It was unfortunately just a few moments later that he was fatally struck by a bullet just under his left eye. His chief of staff, Martin T. McMahon, was close to him and heard his last words and tried to catch him as he fell. Medical personnel were of course called as quickly as possible, but unfortunately he never regained consciousness. In our number 3 spot today, we have Henri de la Tour d'Auvergne. Henri was a French general who has gone down in history as one of the greatest military commanders in modern history. During the Dutch War in the summer campaign in Salzbach on July 27th, 1675, Henri was struck by one of the first shots. I believe it was also a cannonball, so it was just really not a good scene. He laid on the ground, barely able to breathe, when he uttered his last words, which were, quote, I did not mean to be killed today. Aside from that being very honest, it's also quite sad. I always like to picture people's final moments as peaceful or just hope that they have no idea what's happening, but this was of course not the case for him. After his passing, when his death was announced, people all over were mourning the loss as he was an incredibly well-respected man. In our number 2 spot today we have Jan Žižka. Jan is a hero in Czech and was lovingly nicknamed One-Eyed Žižka after he lost one and then both eyes during battle. He is still regarded as one of the most prominent military leaders despite living so long ago, which certainly is quite a legacy. There was quite a bit of time during his life where he and his men were fighting against King Sigismund, who is the king of Bohemia. Jan didn't end up passing away in battle, however. He actually died of the plague in 1492. After his passing, his men called themselves orphans because they felt like they had lost their father, and if that doesn't speak to the kind of leader he was, this next bit definitely will. It has been recorded that his last words were, quote, "Make my skin into drumheads for the Bohemian cause." While kind of gross in thought, I think it definitely shows his commitment and passion in how he wanted to lead his men into battle any way he could, even after his passing. In our number 1 spot today we have Maynard L. Beamy Beamsdorfer. Maynard was a World War II hero who luckily went on to live a very long life after his duty was over. He ended up passing away at the age of 92, and really, who could be upset at making it that far in life, especially when you survived such a high-risk job? He passed away in 2016 and was thankfully surrounded by his family, which truly makes his death one of the most pleasant on this list, which I am very glad about. His final words spoken to his family were, quote, "Did I do good?" I think that is both very sweet and quite sad at the same time. It's wonderful that he was able to be around family, and I am certain they assured him that he did, in fact, do very good. I hope in his final moments he really did feel proud of himself, and I hope when he slipped away, he knew the answer to his question.
Starting things off, in number 10, we have Robert Elton Harris. He said, "You can be a king or a street sweeper, but everyone dances with the Grim Reaper." He was arrested on July 5th of 1978 when him and his brother hijacked a car with 2 teenage boys in it. They ordered them to drive to a remote location where their brothers brutally murdered them, and then they used the vehicle as a getaway car when they robbed a San Diego bank. Robert Harris was arrested just 1 hour after the robbery, and he was charged with murder and auto theft, kidnapping, burglary, and bank robbery. One of the arresting officers was the father of one of the murdered boys, but he didn't realize that the victim was his son until later. He wasn't even able to recognize his son's face. That's how violent the murder was. Robert Harris was sentenced to death in 1979. After many appeals, he was finally executed in San Quentin's gas chamber on April 21st, 1992. Moving up this list with George Engel in at number 9. He was an anarchist who didn't like to follow any sort of rules or regulations. He was involved with a lot of activism and protests in the Chicago area. A protest bombing took place in Haymarket Square in Chicago that resulted in the death of 7 police officers, 4 civilians, and a lot of other people who were seriously injured. George Engel was actually at home playing cards while this riot broke out, and he was arrested the next day and charged with conspiracy in the bombings. He was convicted and sentenced to hanging, but before he took his last breath, he said, "Hurrah for anarchy, this is the happiest moment of my life." Roger Keith Coleman makes his last statement in at number 8. His case gained nationwide attention and major controversy because he maintained his innocence the whole time during his conviction and even right before he was executed. During his final last words, he said, "An innocent man is going to be murdered tonight. When my innocence is proven, I hope Americans will realize the injustice of the death penalty as all other civilized countries have." He was convicted in Virginia for assaulting and murdering his sister-in-law on the day that he has been laid off from work. After his death, the DNA evidence was reanalyzed, and in January 2006, the governor announced that the testing of the DNA evidence has conclusively proven that he was guilty of the crime. Okay, that's great and all, but why don't you think you should have done 1,000 tests on the DNA before you executed him? It makes no sense. What if the DNA evidence proved that he wasn't guilty? What would the press conference look like then? Oops, we made a massive mistake and killed an innocent man. My bad.
Number 7. Eileen Wuornos. Eileen Wuornos was an American serial slayer and prostitute who operated in Florida. In 1989 to 1990, while engaging in street prostitution along highways, she shot and robbed 7 of her male clients. Now, she claimed that her clients had either taken advantage of or tried to take advantage of her, and that all the deaths were committed in self-defense. Eileen was sentenced to death for 6 of the deaths, and on October 9, 2002, after 12 years on Florida's death row, she was executed by lethal injection. Her last words were, "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the Rock and I'll be back like Independence Day, with Jesus, June 6th. Like the movie, big mothership and all, I'll be back." Now, that's incredibly unsettling, and I do not like that she said that at all. Number 6. Charles Manson. Charles Manson was a criminal who created a cult called the Manson family. It was active in California in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Now, the group consisted of approximately 100 followers who lived an unconventional lifestyle and frequently used psychoactive substances. Now, according to group member Susan Atkins, the members of the family became convinced that Manson was a manifestation of Jesus Christ. Now, some of the members committed a series of 9 deaths at 4 locations in July and August of 1969. In 1971, Manson was convicted of first-degree homicide and conspiracy to commit homicide for the deaths of 7 people, including the film actress Sharon Tate. The prosecution contended that while Manson never directly ordered the deaths, his ideology constituted an overt act of conspiracy. Now, on March 4th, 1971, during sentencing hearings, Manson trimmed his beard to a fork and shaved his head, telling the media, "I am the devil, and the devil always has a bald head." Then on March 29th, 1971, the jury sentenced him to death. Manson, though, died from cardiac arrest resulting from respiratory failure brought on by colon cancer at a hospital on November 19th, 2017. His last words were, "I'm the most famous human being not only that is alive, but the most famous human being that has ever lived." Yeah, you can tell he still had a big ego even while looking into the eyes of death. Number 5. Salvador Ramos. You may not know this man's name, but you do know his crime. On May 24th, 2022, Salvador Ramos and his 66-year-old grandmother had an argument over his failure to graduate from high school, during which he shot her in the face before taking her black 2008 Ford F-150. Ramos, using his Facebook account, sent 3 private messages to a girl from Germany whom he had met online. The first said that he was going to shoot his grandmother, the second said that he had shot his grandmother, and a third, about 15 minutes before the said that he was going to open fire at an elementary school. He went to Robb Elementary School, his former school, and fatally 19 students and 2 teachers, while 17 others were injured but survived. Now, details are still fuzzy about what happened, as it took the police forever to get into the building to take Salvador down, but what I could gather is he was in a room and opened the door and said goodnight before officers. In return, the officers back, ending his life. Number 4. Richard Ramirez. Richard Ramirez, dubbed the Night Stalker, had a highly publicized home invasion and life-ending spree that terrorized the residents of the greater Los Angeles area and later the San Francisco Bay Area over the course of 14 months. Richard cultivated a strong interest in Satanism and the occult and would often commit burglaries to support his addiction, many of which were later frequently accompanied by ending people's lives and taking advantage of them. Now, he also frequently enjoyed degrading and humiliating his victims, especially those who survived his attacks or whom he explicitly decided to live by forcing them to profess that they loved Satan or telling them to swear on Satan. Now, he was eventually caught, and in 1989 he was convicted of 13 counts of taking someone's life, 5 attempts of taking someone's life, 11 counts of taking advantage of a person, and 14 burglaries. He was sentenced to death and was on death row. While awaiting his scheduled death, he died on June 7th, 2013 due to health complications, but his last words were, "I am beyond good and evil, I will be avenged." All I gotta say is, I hope he doesn't get avenged. Number 3. Albert Fish. Albert Fish ended the lives of many of the young and was suspected in at least 5 homicides. He was nicknamed the Boogeyman for his predatory behavior. He confessed to 3 deaths that police were able to trace to a known homicide, and he confessed to stabbing at least 2 other people. Now, Albert once boasted that his number of victims was about 100. He abducted Grace Budd in 1928, and in an abandoned home in Westchester County, New York, he ended her life and devoured her body. He wrote a letter to Grace's mother telling her about the crimes he committed against her daughter. He said, "When all was ready, I went to the window and called her. Then I hid in a closet until she was in the room. When she saw me all naked, she began to cry and tried to run downstairs. I grabbed her and she said she would tell her mama. How did she kick, bite, and scratch? I then cut her into small pieces so I could take my meat to my rooms, cook, and eat it." Now this is extremely disturbing and I cannot imagine how her mother felt, and as a result he was executed on January 16th, 1936 in the electric chair, and his last words were reportedly, "I don't even know why I'm here." Which again is disturbing, because did he really think he didn't deserve to die after the horrible crimes he committed? Number 2, Carl Panzram. Carl Panzram was a serial slayer, arsonist, burglar, and someone who took advantage of men. In prison confessions and in his autobiography, he confessed to having committed 21 deaths, only 5 of which could be corroborated. He's suspected of ending the lives of more than 100 men in the United States alone, and several more in Portuguese Angola. He also confessed to having committed more than 1,000 acts of taking advantage of men. His last words were, "In my lifetime, I have murdered 22 human beings. I have committed thousands of burglaries, robberies, larcenies, arsons, and last but not least, I've committed sodomy on more than 1,000 male human beings. For all these things, I am not the least bit sorry." Now again, that's just plain disturbing, as he had no remorse at all. And coming at number 1 is Jake Berg. In 1949, Jake Berg, sometimes referred to as the Tacoma Axe Killer, was arrested by police after breaking into the home of Bertha Klutt and her daughter Beverly June Klutt and ending their lives with an axe. Upon questioning by authorities, Jake revealed intimate knowledge of 33 other deaths of Caucasian women, which made him a prime suspect for those as well. On July 15, 1949, Jake was hanged at the Washington State Penitentiary, but not before he uttered what would be later known as the Bird Hex in his final statement. He said, "I'm putting the Jake Bird Hex on all of you who had anything to do with my being punished. Mark my words, you will die before I do." Now the real scary thing about this is that within a year of his execution, 6 people connected to this case did die. So is it a curse? Was it a coincidence? Who knows?
Starting off this list, in our number 10 spot, we have Michael Ney. Michael Ney was a first Duke, and he was the first Prince of the Moskva, and was a French military commander in the French Revolutionary Wars, as well as the Napoleonic Wars. He was even one of the original 18 marshals of the empire that Napoleon I created. After Napoleon was dethroned and exiled in 1815, however, Michael was arrested and tried by the Chamber of Peers for treason. When the verdict was given, 137 peers voted for the death penalty, 17 voted for deportation, 5 abstained, and there was 1 single vote for acquittal. Unfortunately, this was a majority rules situation, and Michael was sentenced to death by the firing squad. On December 7th, 1815, Michael was put in front of a firing squad, and he refused to wear a blindfold. He was surprisingly given the right to order the fire himself, and before doing so, these are the final words that he spoke. "Soldiers, when I give the command to fire, fire straight at my heart. Wait for the order. It will be my last to you. I protest against my condemnation. I have fought 100 battles for France, and not one against her. Soldiers, fire." I couldn't imagine having to be the one to order your own death, especially when you don't want to die, so this one definitely leaves quite an eerie feeling. In our number 9 spot today we have Pompey the Great. Before I dive into this one, guys, please don't forget to hit the thumbs up button if you're enjoying the video so far, because it really helps us out. Pompey the Great is the oldest person on this list, as he was born in 106 BC and passed away in 48 BC at the age of 57. Pompey was a Roman general, and his career played a significant role in the evolution from a republic to an empire. At one point he was an ally of Julius Caesar, but they became enemies, and this is what led to Pompey's death. In 48 BC there was a civil war in which Caesar beat Pompey's army, and Pompey began to retreat to Egypt. Once he got there, he hoped that King Ptolemy would help him, but unfortunately the king feared Caesar, so instead the king invited him ashore at Pelusium, and it was there that Pompey was assassinated. Pompey's final words were to one of the assassins, and it seems as though Pompey recognized him. He said, "I am not mistaken, surely, in believing you to have been formerly my fellow soldier. Certainly being assassinated is never good, but by people you know and possibly trusted is definitely quite a dark twist." In our number 8 spot today, we have Sir Philip Sidney. Sir Philip Sidney was born in November of 1554 and was an English poet and soldier, and is one of the most prominent figures of the Elizabethan era. In 1586, he joined Sir John Norris in the Battle of Zutphen. Sorry if I said that wrong, in the fight against the Spanish, but it was during this battle that he was shot in the thigh, which would ultimately lead to his death. One of the most well-known stories about Sir Philip Sidney is when he was laying wounded next to another soldier who was also wounded. He spoke his last words to the other soldier when he was giving him his water. He said, "Take it. Thy need is greater than mine." It seems as though he must have known he was about to pass, but it also shows the kind of person he was, which seems to be a very noble person. He certainly left a legacy, considering we are still here talking about him today.
Number 7, Steve Jobs. A little more modern, there we go. When I was making this list, I couldn't believe how long it's been since Steve Jobs has passed away. It's been a while. The tech icon's last moments were in 2011. He was surrounded with love. He had beside him his sister Patty, his children, and his partner Lorraine. Steve looked above them and said, "Oh wow, oh wow, oh wow." He said "oh wow" 3 times. That's pretty heavy stuff to hear. Steve's last moments were shared furthermore when his sister wrote in his eulogy, "Even now he had a stern, still handsome profile, the profile of an absolutist, a romantic." Number 6, Nostradamus. I predict that you'll hit that thumbs up. That's inappropriate, but we'd try our best. The astrologer's last words were in itself predictions. And this last prediction he sadly got right. Nostradamus, full name Michel de Nostradam, published a book on prophecies back in 1555, and in it he had 942 pieces of writing. He had these poems that told the future, right? These texts have supposedly hinted towards the JFK attack, meteors hitting Earth, the invasion of France, global warming, you name it. He said some eerie things about such topics, and he also predicted his own death. On paper, he did. It was his last ever prediction. It was July 1st, 1566. His priest said to him, "Until tomorrow," and Nostradamus replied, "You will not find me alive at sunrise." Sadly, he was correct. Number 5, Beethoven. Another icon, another staple in history, the German composer Ludwig van Beethoven. We've recently heard his work in theaters. In Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, Doctor Strange fights the villain with musical notes. He uses these notes. He uses Beethoven's Symphony No. 5 in C minor. Now we've heard Beethoven in IMAX, right? What a time to be alive. When Ludwig was still alive, he faced many health problems. Hepatitis, jaundice, skin diseases, cirrhosis of the liver, and of course, deafness. When his time came on March 26, 1827, the composer was believed to have said, "Applaud, my friends, the comedy is over." This is false. This is not true at all. Beethoven's close friend, Anselm Hüttenbrenner, who was very much present during his friend's passing, he said his last words were about the case of red wine that had just been delivered from his publisher. Ludwig's true last words followed, and they were, "Pity, pity, too late." About the wine. Fair. More than fair. It was a little too late. Number 4, Marie Antoinette. Another older one, but I figured I'd go more Victorian for this list, you know? Instead of like recent celebrities, that's only depressing. We don't want to talk about those. During the height of the French Revolution, Louis XVI of France and Marie Antoinette were both charged with treason. The phrase, "let them eat cake," is often associated with Mrs. Antoinette in this case, but her last words were actually an apology. Not to the people in which they owed it to, but to the executioner whose foot she stepped on whilst approaching the guillotine. Yeah, shows like Game of Thrones make it look easy to say something cool right before your, demise. In reality, I would beg for my life. Looking up at this dude? Yeah, I would plead. I'd be like, please don't do this. I really don't want this to happen. Number 3, Bob Marley. Of course, we have to mention the one and only reggae legend, Bob Marley, okay? Cancer was the reason that this icon met his fate early. The big C, once again. Marley was only 36 years old when he passed away in 1981. Next to him, he had his son Ziggy, and to him he shared the final words. And I think we could all learn a little something here. He said to Ziggy, "Money can't buy life." Yeah, I'll say that again. Money can't buy life. Not happiness, life. Bob Marley's death was so impactful that the Jamaican government turned this sad day into a national holiday. Yeah, that's a great idea. Live some more of that life. Take the day off. Blast some Marley and, you know the rest. Stuff I can't talk about, light some candles, right? That's an ideal way to mourn somebody as impactful as Bob Marley. I'm here for it. Number 2. Giles Corey. Out of the 27 people who had their lives taken away from them during the 1692 Salem witch trials, 19 were hanged, 17 passed away in prison while serving their sentence, and the last victim, Giles Corey, refused to plead either innocent or guilty. And the law at the time states that you can't be tried otherwise, so he did what was ultimately best for him and his family and his estate. The townsfolk laid a heavy board on top of the 81-year-old man during the witch trials and all that nonsense, and then over the course of 2 days, boulders were slowly added, making the weight more and more unbearable. They were hoping that Giles would admit something, either being innocent or guilty, whatever the case, but every time they asked him anything, Giles responded with, "More weight." How epic is that? Extremely brave. This is something like, it sounds easy, but in reality, I would never do this. I would fold immediately. I would be like, this is so hard. But sadly, after 2 days of this torture, Giles passed away. He fought for so long and did what he could because if he had gone either of the other 2 ways, Giles would have his property taken away from the town. But since he passed away not admitting guilt, he was still in full possession of his estate, which immediately went to his son-in-law. And finally, number 1, Robin Williams. Okay, I wanted to end on one that really hit home for me personally. I try and bring comedy into these lists whenever I can. It's like, cursed dolls that will haunt your family. I'm like, okay, I try and jazz it up a bit. I try and add some physicality to it whenever I can, brighten the mood. Because I was raised watching this man right here. Robin sadly passed away in August 2014. I was 19 at the time. I still remember the day, right? It was the first celebrity death that actually did something to me physically. And I don't mean for that to sound sensitive, but I grew up with this man, right? He was like Hook, Aladdin, robots, so underrated, right? Robin's wife Susan Schneider Williams revealed her husband's last words in an interview with ABC. And when the couple was getting ready for bed the night before, his last words were, "Good night, good night." Yeah, I wanted to end on a nice, good, peaceful note instead of something horrible from the 1700s. There we go.
Number 10. Eileen Wuornos. Eileen Wuornos was an American serial killer and prostitute who operated in Florida. In 1989 to 1990, while engaging in street prostitution along highways, she shot dead and robbed 7 of her male clients. She claimed that her clients had either taken advantage of or tried to take advantage of her, and that all the deaths were committed in self-defense. Eileen was sentenced to death for 6 of the deaths, and on October 9th, 2002, after 12 years on Florida's death row, she was executed by lethal injection. Her last words were, "I just like to say I'm sailing with the Rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus June 6th. Like the movie Big Mothership and all, I'll be back." Number 9. Robert Charles Towery. Robert Charles Towery ended the life of Robert Jones, a philanthropist who loaned money to him on several occasions and used him as a mechanic. Robert Jones was in his home when Robert Towery asked him to use his phone. Once inside, he pulled a weapon on him and handcuffed him. He then proceeded to take $1,200 and load jewelry, electronics, and other items into his car before he led his victim to the master bedroom at gunpoint. He laid the victim face down on the bed and injected him using a veterinary syringe filled with battery acid. He told the victim the substance would put him to sleep, but he passed away. Robert was arrested and put on death row in Arizona. On March 8, 2012, he was put to death by lethal injection. During Robert's last moments, he apologized to the victim's family and cursed his bad mistakes. His last words were, "I love my family, potato, potato, potato." The potato reference was a secret message to his nephew, apparently. It's the sound that a Harley Davidson motorcycle makes when the engine is idle, and it was a way of saying that everything is okay, or was it? I don't know. Number 8. Grover Cleveland Redding. Grover Cleveland Redding believed he was the Prince of Abyssinia and was on a mission to bring his people back to the homeland. He started an anti-government riot, and at some point the Abyssinians started burning US flags. 2 white cops approached them, but the Abyssinians were armed and chased them off. A black cop approached them and he was shot. One Abyssinian burned a flag and quoted it, shouting the following, "As we have destroyed these flags, we are going to destroy your government. Our government is backing us." This provoked the calling of every Southside police district to send 20 men and a commanding officer to the protest. Allegedly, 700 policemen responded in 20 minutes. They stopped the Abyssinians before any more violence. All participants were arrested within a week, and Grover was sentenced to death for starting an anti-government riot in which 2 of his followers were killed. He was hanged, and his last words were, "I have something to say, but not at this time." And I guess we'll never know.
In our number 7 spot today, we have Joachim Murat. Joachim Murat was a marshal of the Empire and an admiral to Napoleon, and he was also the king of Naples from 1808 to 1815. A lot of people attribute his titles to the fact that he actually married Napoleon's younger sister, Caroline Bonaparte, but he is also remembered as brave and charismatic. He was also known as a fancy dresser, so he gained the nickname the Dandy King, which I love. After the fall of Napoleon, he was captured by the forces of King Ferdinand IV of Naples and was eventually tried and sentenced to death by firing squad. When the time came, he refused a chair and a blindfold and said, "I have braved death too often to fear it." He then stood up tall and proudly and kissed a carving of the face of his wife that he had with him, and then he spoke his final words, which were, "Soldiers, do your duty, straight to the heart but spare the face. Fire." Honestly, I don't know how these people stay so calm and collected during these undoubtedly terrifying moments. In our number 6 spot today, we have Major Lloyd Williams. Major Lloyd Williams was born in 1887 and was an officer in the United States Marine Corps and passed away fighting in World War I. On June 11th of 1918, he was leading an assault and had been sent to help the French army in the Battle of Belleau Wood, which barely left anyone on their side alive. When they first arrived, they found the French retreating already, but Lloyd did not want to. When a French major told Lloyd to retreat, he told him to go to hell, which I guess I can appreciate. Later in the battle, Lloyd found himself gassed and injured by shrapnel and was down on the battlefield, severely injured. When medics approached him, he spoke his last words, which were, "Don't bother with me, take care of my good men." I obviously have no knowledge of what would have happened if they did choose to retreat when the French major suggested it, but I definitely think it is honorable that he ensured his men were tended to first. In our number 5 spot today, we have Murray Hudson. Murray Hudson was born in 1938 and was a sergeant with the Royal New Zealand Infantry Regiment. On February 13th, 1974, Murray was a drill instructor and was supervising a training exercise when things really took a turn for the worst. One of the officers in training, or a non-commissioned officer who was participating in this training exercise, accidentally armed a grenade that he was about to throw. This is obviously an incredibly frightening situation and one that made the officer completely freeze. After all, what really do you do in that situation? Murray saw him freeze and realized what had happened and ordered him to throw it, which I guess is the smartest move and the thing that you would do in this situation. The officer unfortunately was still frozen and wasn't reacting, so in an attempt to save him, Murray went over and took his hand and tried to release the grenade so that he could throw it. During this process, the grenade unfortunately exploded, which took both of their lives. The final words of Murray were his directions and him saying, "Throw it, just throw it." Such a tragic event that absolutely could have been avoided. Murray was awarded the George Cross after his passing, which is the highest award bestowed by the British government for gallantry not in the presence of an enemy. In our number 4 spot today, we have Louis Joseph de Montcalm. Louis Joseph was a French soldier who was born in 1712 and was commander of the forces in North America during the 7 Years' War. In September of 1759, he decided to attack the British with the forces he had instead of waiting for more people and more numbers. Many people believed that this was his greatest mistake, but he felt like if he waited, they wouldn't have been able to defeat the British. That may be true, but without waiting, the British of course still defeated the French forces. Louis was riding back to the city when he was struck by a musket shot in the back. There were 3 soldiers who helped him back to the city and to a surgeon who explained that he wouldn't be able to even make it through the night. Before his commanding officers left him for the last time, he had some not so nice words for them. His final words happened to be, "I have much business that must be attended to of greater moment than your ruined garrison and this wretched country." Considering he's talking about the country that I live in, that seems a little rude, but I can understand why he felt that way. way. In our number 3 spot today we have Simon Bolivar. Simon, who is often referred to as the Liberator, was born in 1783 and was a military and political leader that led Venezuela, Bolivia, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Panama to their independence from the Spanish Empire. He was 47 years old in 1830 and had resigned from his presidency and was planning on heading to Europe. He even had already sent crates of his belongings, but unfortunately fell extremely ill before he was able to leave his country. On December 17th of 1830, he was about to lose his battle with tuberculosis and was extremely delirious, so his last words are actually very strange. There are some accounts that his last words were, "Damn it, how will I ever get out of this labyrinth?" And other accounts say that his final words were, "Fetch the luggage, they do not want us here." Truthfully, either way, it is clear that he wasn't necessarily in his right mind, but it's also very clear that he was looking for some way out or some sort of escape. In our number 2 spot today we have John Sedgwick. John Sedgwick was born in 1813 and was a military officer and Union Army general during the American Civil War. On May 9th, 1864, he and his men were at the Spotsylvania courthouse and he was directing different placements when Confederate sharpshooters, who were around 1,000 yards away, began shooting at them. This of course caused for some of John's men to duck for cover like any regular human being would when being shot at. I'm not exactly sure why, but John seemed to have been less concerned with the shots and more concerned with the soldiers taking cover, and he continued to strut around and say, "I'm ashamed of you. They couldn't hit an elephant at this distance." It was unfortunately just a few moments later that he was fatally struck by a bullet just under his left eye. His chief of staff, Martin T. McMahon, was close to him and heard his last words and tried to catch him as he fell. Medical personnel were of course called as quickly as possible, but unfortunately he never regained consciousness. In our number 1 spot today we have Alexander Prokhorenko. In 2016, Alexander was a senior lieutenant with the Special Armed Forces of the Russian Armed Forces. He was 25 years old at the time and was fighting in the Syrian Civil War. On March 17th of 2016, during the Palmyra offensive, he found himself surrounded by ISIS militants. Not wanting to be captured alive and also bravely doing what he thought was best, he ordered an airstrike on his location. His command was slightly confused in the beginning of this order and asked him to confirm his order, and this is when Alexander spoke his final words to command. He said, "They are outside. This is the end, Commander. Thank you. Tell my family and my country I love them. Tell them I was brave and I fought until I could no longer. Please take care of my family. Avenge my death. Goodbye, Commander. Tell my family I love them." Alexander left behind his wife Katya and the child they were expecting at the time of his death. He was nicknamed the Russian Rambo after his death and was awarded the title Hero of the Russian Federation for his ultimate sacrifice.